On April 12, 2022, in the Chernihiv region of northern Ukraine, one of Russia's rarest armored vehicles was filmed burning on the battlefield. It was not a main battle tank. It was not a missile system. Few outside military circles had even heard its name. Yet its destruction marked something deeper than the loss of a single vehicle. The war in Ukraine has not only consumed equipment, it has exposed design choices made decades ago. It has forced old doctrines into direct confrontation with modern surveillance, drones, and precision fire. Some systems adapt, others disappear quietly. The story of this vehicle is not about rarity. It is about what happens when a military theory meets a new kind of war. To understand why, we must first understand what it was built to do. The BMOT was built for one clear mission, and that mission was to carry and support infantry teams armed with the RPO-A Shmel thermobaric launcher into close combat under heavy protection. This vehicle was not created as a general transport or a flexible battlefield platform. Instead, it was designed around a specific idea inside Russian military thinking, where thermobaric weapons are treated as a serious assault tool rather than a rare specialty weapon. To understand why such a machine appeared at all, we have to go back to the 1990s, when the Soviet Union had collapsed and the newly formed Russian Federation was struggling with deep economic crisis, shrinking defense budgets, and a massive inventory of aging armored vehicles that it could not afford to replace. After 1991, Russia inherited thousands of T-72 tanks, and by most estimates, roughly 18,000 variants of the T-72 family had been produced since the 1970s, with large numbers of the upgraded T-72B still sitting in storage. Many of these tanks were no longer modern enough for frontline armored warfare against NATO standards, yet their hulls and engines were still usable, and their thick frontal armor remained valuable. At a time when defense funding was tight and corruption was widespread, building a completely new heavy armored personnel carrier from scratch was not realistic. So converting old tank hulls into specialized carriers became a practical solution. This decision was less about ambition and more about survival, because reusing existing platforms reduced research costs, shortened production timelines, and allowed Russia to preserve heavy assault capability without launching an expensive modernization program. The doctrinal reason behind the BMOT is just as important as the economic one, because Russia treats thermobaric weapons very differently from most Western armies. In NATO forces, thermobaric munitions exist, but they are usually reserved for specific missions such as clearing caves or hardened targets, and they are not central to everyday infantry formations. In contrast, Russian military doctrine integrates thermobaric weapons into formal units, including formations linked to chemical defense troops, and these systems are seen as key tools for urban combat and breaching fortified positions. During conflicts in Chechnya and later in Syria, Russian forces relied heavily on heavy firepower to break resistance inside buildings and strongpoints, and thermobaric weapons fit that approach because they generate intense overpressure and heat that can destroy enclosed spaces with brutal efficiency. The BMOT was therefore created as a protected delivery vehicle for these assault teams, giving them thick armor on the way to the fight while allowing them to operate in environments where heavy resistance was expected. Using the T-72B chassis made sense within this framework because the tank already provided strong frontal armor and a powerful diesel engine, and the platform had been produced in such large numbers that spare parts and maintenance knowledge were widely available. Instead of investing in a new hull layout, Russian engineers removed the turret and reworked the upper structure to create space for a crew and a group of infantry carrying RPO-A Shmel launchers. This approach followed a pattern seen in other countries that reused tank hulls for heavy carriers. But in Russia's case, the redesign was limited by financial and industrial constraints. The choice showed that Moscow was still leaning on Soviet-era hardware rather than introducing a new generation of armored vehicles designed from the ground up for modern combined arms warfare. In that sense, the BMOT sends a clear industrial signal because it reflects a defense sector that preferred adaptation over transformation in the decades after the Cold War. While Russia later introduced platforms like the T-90M, and spoke about next-generation systems such as the Armata family. The BMOT belonged to an earlier phase when the priority was to extract value from existing stockpiles rather than invest heavily in fresh concepts. It was a product of its time, shaped by economic limits, doctrinal tradition, and the belief that heavy armor could still push infantry safely through hostile fire in dense urban terrain. The vehicle was never meant for fast maneuver warfare across open fields. It was designed for shock assault under thick steel, moving forward with confidence that armor could absorb punishment long enough to deliver its troops to the point of attack. But the protection it promised came at a price that would shape its fate on a modern battlefield. The BMOT was built with a clear belief that thick armor could solve most battlefield problems, but its weapon setup shows how much firepower was sacrificed to keep that protection. The vehicle carries only one integrated weapon, the NSVT 12.7mm heavy machine gun, and that single system defines both its strength and its weakness. There is no autocannon for engaging armored targets, no anti-tank guided missile for long-range threats, and no remote-controlled turret that can operate safely from inside the hull. In a time when many infantry fighting vehicles around the world carry 30mm cannons or advanced missile systems, the BMOT relies on a machine gun first introduced during the Soviet era, and that decision shapes how it survives, or fails to survive, on a modern battlefield. The way that machine gun is operated adds another serious limitation, because the commander must open the hatch and stand partially exposed to control it. In earlier wars, this was risky but often necessary, and commanders across the world accepted that exposure as part of armored combat. In Ukraine, however, the battlefield is filled with small drones that can hover quietly above vehicles and send video back to artillery units within minutes. A commander rising from the hatch becomes visible not only to enemy soldiers but to cameras in the sky, and that changes the risk calculation completely. When artillery response times are short and loitering munitions can strike quickly, even a few seconds of exposure can turn into a fatal moment. And that reality makes the BMOT's weapon system feel outdated in this environment. The protection philosophy behind the vehicle remains serious and heavy, because its front arc includes thick armor inherited from the T-72 platform and additional Contact 5 explosive reactive armor blocks mounted on key areas. Contact 5 was once considered advanced, and Soviet designers claimed it could reduce the impact of armor-piercing rounds and shaped charges. The sides also received added layers and internal lining to limit damage from penetrating fragments, which shows that engineers were focused on keeping the crew alive during direct fire engagements. On paper, this creates the image of a tough assault carrier that can push forward under fire, absorb hits, and deliver infantry close to enemy positions. That concept fits the Russian approach to urban assault, where shock and pressure often replace speed and flexibility. The strategic contradiction becomes clear when we look at how modern threats work, because heavy frontal armor does not guarantee safety in a war where attacks often come from above or from unexpected angles. Small unmanned aircraft can drop explosive charges onto the roof, where protection is thinner, and anti-tank teams can target weaker areas with precision-guided systems. A single heavy machine gun is effective against infantry and lightly protected vehicles, but it cannot reliably stop armored fighting vehicles or long-range missile teams. This means the BMOT depends heavily on supporting units for protection against stronger threats, and that reduces its independence during operations. Instead of being a self-contained assault platform, it becomes a carrier that must operate within a larger combined arms system to survive. When compared to many Western infantry fighting vehicles, the difference in philosophy becomes even clearer, because modern IFVs often combine armor with significant firepower and advanced optics. Vehicles such as the Bradley or Puma are designed to move troops while also engaging armored targets at range, and they use stabilized cannons, guided missiles, and protected firing positions to reduce crew exposure. The BMOT, by contrast, emphasizes armor thickness and assumes that close support and aggressive movement will compensate for limited onboard weapons. That assumption may have worked in conflicts where air power and reconnaissance were less advanced. But in Ukraine, the battlefield rewards precision, coordination, and layered defense more than simple mass and steel. In practical terms, this design choice means the BMOT can withstand certain types of attack while struggling against others. And that imbalance becomes dangerous when facing a well-equipped opponent. Protection is valuable, but without balanced firepower and modern situational awareness systems, a heavy vehicle can still become a target rather than a shield. Armor alone, however, cannot solve structural design flaws that become fatal once troops begin to move. The BMOT's biggest weakness is not the thickness of its steel, but the way its soldiers must enter and leave the vehicle under fire. Unlike many modern armored carriers that use a rear ramp to allow troops to dismount quickly while staying protected, this platform forces infantry to climb over the engine deck and exit through roof hatches at the back. That movement may sound simple on paper, yet on a real battlefield it becomes the most dangerous moment of the mission, because the troops are fully visible while stepping down from a tall armored hull. In Ukraine, where small drones constantly scan the ground and artillery can respond within minutes, those few seconds of exposure can mean the difference between survival and loss. This design creates a serious tactical problem because the dismount phase is often when infantry are most vulnerable. When soldiers exit a vehicle, they are not yet in cover, and they are focused on positioning rather than scanning for threats. A protected ramp allows them to move quickly behind the hull and spread out with some shield from direct fire. In the BMOT, however, the engine placement blocks that option, so the troops must step onto the rear surface, balance themselves, and climb down while exposed from above and from the sides. In a war where loitering munitions and quadcopters track movement in real time, this method increases risk during the exact moment when coordination matters most. Mobility limitations add another layer to this issue, because the vehicle still uses the transmission system from the original T-72 tank, and that system is known for its weak reverse speed. In fast-moving combat, the ability to back away quickly can save both crew and passengers, especially when facing ambush or anti-tank teams. If a vehicle cannot disengage rapidly, it may remain in a kill zone longer than intended. Reports from earlier conflicts already pointed out that the T-72 family struggled with fast retreat, and that characteristic carries over to the BMOT. In an environment where precision strikes and drone-guided artillery are common, slow withdrawal reduces the margin for error and leaves little time to react once detected. The limits of explosive reactive armor also become clearer in this new type of war, because Contact 5 was designed mainly to counter direct anti-tank threats, such as shaped charges and kinetic penetrators. It was effective in an era when the main danger came from frontal engagements between armored vehicles or from handheld anti-tank weapons fired from the ground. Today, many attacks come from above, where top armor is thinner and protective blocks may not cover the entire surface. Small unmanned aircraft can drop explosive devices directly onto the roof, and loitering munitions can dive at steep angles, bypassing the areas where reactive plates are strongest. This does not mean the armor is useless, but it shows that it was designed for a different threat model than the one dominating the Ukrainian battlefield. The engineering layout makes improvement difficult, because the engine remains in the rear section where a ramp would normally be installed. To create a safer exit system, designers would need to relocate major components and redesign the internal structure, which would essentially require building a new vehicle rather than modifying an old one. That level of change demands funding, time, and industrial capacity, and it cannot be achieved with minor adjustments. As a result, the BMOT remains locked into its original configuration, and that configuration reflects priorities set decades ago. The broader strategic lesson is clear because the vehicle represents a style of thinking shaped by Soviet-era frontal assault doctrine, where heavy armor pushed forward and assumed that protection would absorb the worst of incoming fire. Modern conflict, however, strikes from multiple angles and often from the sky, which weakens the advantage of thick frontal plating. Even so, the platform's true purpose lay not in its armor, but in the weapon it carried. The RPO-A Shmel is the reason the BMOT exists, and it is one of the most destructive infantry weapons in Russia's arsenal. This shoulder-launched system fires a thermobaric rocket that creates a fuel-air explosion, and that type of blast works differently from a normal high-explosive round. When the rocket hits its target, it releases a cloud of flammable material that mixes with oxygen, and then a second charge ignites it, producing intense heat and a powerful pressure wave. In open space, the blast radius can reach roughly 50 meters, but inside buildings, bunkers, or trenches, the overpressure effect becomes far more deadly because the shock wave reflects off walls and ceilings. That is why the weapon has long been used for clearing fortified positions and urban strongpoints. The psychological effect of this system is just as important as its physical damage, because thermobaric explosions generate both fire and crushing pressure in a single moment. Soldiers caught inside enclosed areas often face extreme heat that can exceed several thousand degrees Fahrenheit at the center of the blast, and the sudden pressure drop that follows can cause severe internal injuries, even if there are no visible wounds. During earlier conflicts in Chechnya and later in Syria, Russian forces relied on heavy firepower to break resistance in dense urban fighting, and weapons like the Shmel were part of that approach. The goal was not only to destroy enemy positions, but also to shock defenders and reduce their will to continue resisting. In that sense, the RPO-A was designed for brutal efficiency in close combat. However, the weapon's strength also creates a serious operational limit when paired with the BMOT, because it cannot be fired from inside the vehicle. The rocket produces strong backblast, and that rearward pressure and heat would endanger anyone standing behind it in a confined space. There is no internal firing port designed for this system, and using it inside the armored hull would risk injuring the crew and passengers. As a result, the infantry must either climb out fully or at least rise through upper hatches before launching a round. That movement exposes them during the exact moment when they are preparing to engage a target. In the current battlefield environment in Ukraine, exposure time has become extremely dangerous because small unmanned aircraft constantly scan streets, tree lines, and building rooftops. Commercial drones modified for military use can hover quietly above an area and transmit video in real time, allowing artillery units to adjust fire within minutes. If a thermobaric team dismounts, takes aim, and fires, that sequence may be observed from the sky, and incoming rounds can follow shortly after. Urban areas are especially monitored, and both sides have learned to strike quickly once movement is detected. In such conditions, even a powerful weapon cannot fully compensate for the risk created by stepping outside armored protection. This leads to a clear strategic contradiction at the heart of the design. The BMOT was built to protect thermobaric troops as they approach contested areas, and its heavy armor suggests that survivability was the priority during transit. Yet the very weapon those troops carry forces them to leave that protection before they can use it. The vehicle shields them on the way in, but the mission itself demands exposure at the critical moment of engagement. That tension between protection and employment defines the limits of the system in a war shaped by constant observation and rapid strike capability. In earlier decades, when battlefield surveillance was less advanced and response times were slower, this trade-off might have been acceptable. Infantry would dismount, fire, and reposition before the enemy could react with precision. In Ukraine, where both sides rely heavily on drone reconnaissance and networked artillery, that window has narrowed dramatically. The RPO-A Shmel remains a fearsome tool in confined spaces, and its destructive power is not in doubt. What has changed is the environment in which it must be used. And with so few vehicles ever produced, each loss carried disproportionate weight. The BMOT was never built in large numbers, and that fact alone shapes its story on the battlefield. Most estimates suggest that only around 10 to 15 units ever entered active service, which means it was never a core element of Russia's armored force structure. Unlike main battle tanks or standard infantry carriers produced in the hundreds or thousands, this platform remained a niche system tied to a specific mission. When a vehicle exists in such small numbers, every single loss becomes more than a statistic, because it directly reduces the available fleet in a visible way. Confirmed battlefield evidence shows that at least 3 BMOT vehicles were destroyed in 2022, and at least one was captured by Ukrainian forces. Video footage and photographs circulated online, and open-source analysts were able to verify several of these incidents through geolocation and cross-checking. One of the earliest confirmed losses occurred in April 2022 in the Chernihiv region, during the intense fighting in northern Ukraine. Later in the year, additional destruction was reported in other areas of active combat. In one case, images appeared showing a captured vehicle being reused by Ukrainian forces, although it remains unclear whether that platform was fully restored or used only for limited purposes. When a country has only a dozen examples of a specific system, losing 3 or 4 in a short period represents a significant percentage of the total force. Even if we assume the higher estimate of 15 vehicles, the confirmed losses already account for roughly 1/4 of the fleet. If we use the lower estimate of 10 units, then 3 destroyed machines represent nearly 1/3 of the total. In military terms, that level of attrition would be serious for any rare asset. The math is simple, and it highlights how fragile such a small inventory can be under sustained combat pressure. The economic dimension also matters because even though the BMOT was not as expensive as a modern main battle tank, it still required specialized modification and maintenance. Replacing a destroyed vehicle is not as easy as pulling another standard carrier from storage, since this platform was built in limited numbers and tailored for a narrow role. Production lines for such conversions are not always active, and restarting them in wartime can take time, money, and industrial focus. When losses mount, commanders must decide whether the benefit of deploying the remaining vehicles outweighs the risk of further reduction. Operational consequences follow naturally from that calculation, because rare platforms often become high-value targets once the enemy understands their importance. If Ukrainian forces identify a BMOT on the battlefield, it may attract priority attention from artillery, anti-tank teams, or drones. In a conflict where both sides monitor social media and open-source intelligence, unusual equipment quickly gains visibility. That visibility can shorten its battlefield lifespan. As a result, Russian commanders may choose to limit deployment of the remaining vehicles, keeping them away from high-intensity zones where the risk of destruction is greatest. The information warfare factor complicates the picture, because official statements during war often present higher or lower numbers depending on the source. Ukrainian authorities have reported significant destruction of Russian equipment across multiple categories, while independent tracking groups such as Oryx have confirmed losses through visual evidence. The gap between official claims and verified data is not unusual in wartime reporting, and it reflects the fog of war as well as the role of morale and messaging. In the case of the BMOT, the confirmed losses are clear, yet the exact number still operational remains uncertain. What is certain is that the fleet is small, and every confirmed hit reduces its presence further. Even if several vehicles remain intact, their limited quantity restricts their strategic impact. The system was never widespread, and the pressure of combat has narrowed its footprint even more. As these vehicles faded from regular frontline reports, Russia increasingly leaned on a different thermobaric solution. The BMOT was never a war-winning system, yet its disappearance tells us more about Russia's position than its designers likely expected. When the first confirmed destruction appeared in April 2022, it signaled that even rare and specialized equipment was not safe on this battlefield. By late 2022, with at least 3 destroyed and 1 captured, the numbers alone showed how fragile such a limited fleet could be. If only 10 to 15 were ever built, then every loss carried real weight, and holding the remaining vehicles back suggests concern about survivability rather than confidence in performance. In this war, adaptation matters more than legacy strength, and systems built for past assumptions are struggling under modern pressure. If you value clear analysis without hype, subscribe to Military Force, because we break down what these losses truly mean for the balance of power.